The series of 3 games, including Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and Detroit Become Human, feel like you're playing through a movie or an interactive storybook as you reach certain key interactions and make choices that affect the story as a whole. If there was ever a genre of games that blurred the lines between cinema and video games, this would be it, and while there used to be some competition from the Telltale game studio, I think that Quantic Dreams pull it all off a little bit better than anyone else. By their very nature, I'm gonna have to reveal some spoilers about each of the games as I run through the storylines, gameplay, and design decisions in order to show you what each game did and didn't do well. As such, if you've ever been interested in playing through these games and haven't done so already, there's never been a better time to do so since they just released on Steam as of May 25th, 2020. On the other hand, if you've already played through the games, I think you might find this video especially interesting, considering the butterfly effect nature of the games and how wildly one person's playthrough of the game can change compared to another. I'll say it up front, I think that the Quantic Dreams games series is one of the most unique and worthwhile interactive media experiences you could ever have, and I'm going to spend the next hour or so showing you how the series evolved and grew into the position it holds today. My name is JB Jet, and this is a critique for Detroit Become Human, Beyond Two Souls, and Heavy Rain.
Hello. Welcome to the Detroit Experience. I'm an android, and I'll be your hostess.
I'd like to start with Detroit because this was my personal introduction to the series as a whole. While I had always known of the existence of Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls, I had always just let them pass me by since I was playing other games at the time or just never had a good opportunity to pick them up. And I probably would have done the same with Detroit if I didn't end up seeing Preacher Gaming pick it up on Twitch one day. So my first playthrough of a Quantic Dreams game was actually just me watching a Let's Play of the title, with an experience closer to watching a movie than it was to actually playing a game. And I absolutely loved it. I bought the game on PS4 and played through it 2 times, had my mom play it through it once, then a couple years later introduced it to my wife, who wanted to go back and experience just about every option the game had to offer. And despite not personally being the one playing all 7 or so times, watching somebody else play the game was just as valid and positive of an experience. Where one person might go into Kara's storyline guns blazing, another playthrough they spent their entire time hiding to avoid notice, while another person missed the entire storyline because they obeyed orders in the very first scene. And I think that marks one of the greatest strengths of the series, that the games are built around and accept the idea that you might not always succeed, that you're both presented with and allowed the ability to sacrifice yourself in one playthrough as a martyr, and the game has the audacity to end that storyline. Like, yeah, you let the main character die due to your choices, and unless you go back for another playthrough, those choices are gonna stick with you and have ramifications. There are no real failure states in these games, only different choices and paths through the story as you make your way through an interconnected web of decisions. Now before I get ahead of myself, let me introduce you to the actual mechanics of the games. Each game follows the story of between 2 to 4 playable characters that you can control through scripted events and interactive areas. Take for example the beginning of Kara's storyline in Detroit, where you'll end up being told to clean up the house, which involves following several input prompts to do chores like take down the clothes, do the dishes, and take out the trash. Most of the time, however, the actions you'll be taking will be much more dramatic, such as searching for clues in a crime scene or taking part in QuickTime events when your character inevitably gets into a fight or you have to deal with a hazard. Each game then adds on several gimmick-style events, like how in Detroit you can analyze your decisions in advance, or in Beyond Two Souls, where you can control a ghost-like character. The real crux of the game more often comes into play when you come to key decision points where the player may have to make a time choice on which route to take through the game. And that's just about it for the complexity of the gameplay. The inputs you're asked to do are never really that complex, the button mashing doesn't ask for too much effort, and the QuickTime events are usually more than forgiving if you mess up a few times during a sequence. Obviously, the game was made to tell a story rather than challenging the player with precise platforming or twitch second-to-second combat. And yet, for most people on their first playthrough, it can leave them in a cold sweat as they try their hardest to make the story play out the way that they want, to reach the theoretical good ending that they think is the best result. In order to truly make these games interesting, the stories differentiate themselves by staying away from traditional actions or rom-com roles and instead focusing each game on a couple of controversial themes like slavery and what it means to be human. Then, because it's an interactive medium, it goes on to focus on asking you questions about those themes and how you might perceive them instead of telling you what's right or wrong. Detroit then gives you the freedom to succeed in either a violent or peaceful civil rights movement, as well as the ability to either join the movement or destroy it while playing as the police character, before letting you decide whether that was a satisfactory ending or not. See, when a medium leaves itself open to player control, it also loses its ability to tell a decisive story in every scenario, and instead becomes more of a mirror into the soul of the player. Since the game cannot act like a book or a movie and tell the same story for every player, each experience is tailored to the values of that individual as they mold the general shape of the story into their own image. From the standpoint of a game or literary-focused player, it may be to the game's detriment, because a story that never stays the same can never relay the strongest arguments for or against something, and yet, it's that ambiguous mishmash of ideas and the 101 different ways you can make your way through its theme that I think makes it a valid exploration of topics like race and equality that the United States is struggling with, especially in the summer of 2020. You won't find an award-winning criticism of the racial divide here. The portrayal of human rights movements isn't 100% accurate, and the game certainly is whitewashed in many ways, but I also don't think that a convincing argument was the goal of the game. Instead, they focus on the questions of what would you do, how would you do it, and were the consequences worth it? I really can't go any further without getting into major spoilers about the game, so if what I just said tipped your interest and you want to play through them blind, then I'd suggest you stop here. Otherwise, I can assure you based on my own experiences that the games are just as worth playing through after seeing a summary of the whole plot as they are playing blind. So you shouldn't feel like you're missing much if you decide to watch this entire video before touching them. If you played some games before but not others, I put up timestamps on the video and in the description below if you'd like to skip to certain games or avoid the ones you haven't played yet. So let's dive right in with Detroit Become Human, a story that follows the actions of three main characters, Marcus, Connor, and Kara. All three controllable characters are androids, robots capable of independent thought but initially programmed to fulfill specific tasks, and designed to look almost indistinguishable from humans except for a mood ring LED on their foreheads. We're introduced to the world of Detroit from the perspective of Connor as we quickly learn that androids are not particularly treated with respect.
Please, please, you gotta save my little girl. Wait. You're sending an android?
All right, ma'am. We need to go.
You can't do that. Why aren't you sending a real person? Joel, that's danger!
Connor was built by CyberLife to be a detective android and assist the police force with any investigations involving defective androids, which leads us to the prologue sequence where an android has murdered its owner and taken a little girl hostage, where you have to act as the negotiator. Despite their distrust in you, the police force has to let you at least try, since any attempts to send a human negotiator have failed, since the renegade android shoots anyone that moves near him. So after doing some research around the house, you learn that the android was about to be replaced, which forced him into this situation, and you can either try to talk to him into letting the hostage go, or shoot him yourself. Either way, the police will dispose of the deviant, and we're introduced to Connor's naturally cold personality as he leaves the human policemen to take care of the girl after his mission has been accomplished. In all seriousness, there's 6 different possible endings where Connor gets shot, Connor dies protecting the little girl, Connor saves the girl by jumping off the building, and one where you just let the deviant jump. All of these are what I would call fail states of various levels of moral gray, and for the rest of the video, I'll generally be ignoring them since it's relatively easy to tell which direction will lead you down the wrong path. But what's interesting about this game compared to others in the Quantic Dream catalog is the ability to present players with a character that can die as many times as you let him in the main story and still come back, since Connor is a company android and can be easily replaced by CyberLife. This is how Detroit knows that it can present you with around 100 different scenarios for main character deaths, but can always guarantee that you'll at least finish one storyline to its end. This short sequence also introduces the player to the interesting gray area that the game attempts to straddle, where even if you do absolutely everything right in order to get the quote-unquote good ending and convince the deviant to free the girl, the police will still decide to shoot the android, which indicates how most of the good-natured endings still come with a lot of caveats. Likewise, the scene also introduces the general flow of the game that you'll be following as you typically enter a scene, are presented with an open area to explore and unlock options for later, before being thrown into either a quick-paced dialogue sequence, a combat QTE, or both. After this, the game introduces you to the second character named Kara, who is a caregiver android who gets picked up from the local CyberLife store by her owner Todd. The game introduces you to the Detroit area with the intro sequence as you drive back to the house, and then seamlessly familiarizes players with the typical inputs you'll be using for the rest of the game by having you do the chores. At the same time, you'll be introduced to Todd's daughter named Alice, who is instantly sympathetic to most players simply due to the way that her dad treats her and the way she seems to live in fear. Also, the game both establishes Todd's instability as well as a reason to dislike him, if you didn't already based upon his reactions when Kara finds some drugs hidden in the laundry room. Finally, we're introduced to Marcus, who is picking up a paint order for his elderly owner that happens to be an artist. While his introduction scene is short, it does force you into your first confrontation based on pent-up resentment between androids and humans as you run into an anti-android rally by the bus stop. After they rough up Marcus a bit, a police officer stops them, but only in order to stop them from damaging property, not because it's cruel to do to a person, thus establishing the in-world administration's approach to android treatment. It simultaneously establishes the idea that many humans resent androids for the basic fact that they can do most things better than humans can, which kind of seems unnecessary in establishing systemic discrimination in the world, but makes sense why they would include it in the context of real-world rallies regarding immigrant employment. We're then brought back to Connor and his role in the story as the first android detective attached to a police force as he meets his new partner, Hank Anderson, a deadbeat cop who lost his son and his will to live as he spirals into alcoholism. Think about the movie Bright, but actually done well. I think the character play between the cold naivete of Connor and the disgruntled realism of Hank is some of the best dialogue in the game, depending on the direction you take with it. By this point in the game, players should have been introduced to the relationship status with certain characters and how certain actions might affect those relationships depending on whether they approve or disapprove of your actions. While relationship stats have been done before, most commonly in RPGs with companion characters, in Detroit, many of these values can have dramatic effects on the way that side characters will act independently from your own decisions. Similarly, in the next scene with Kara, we're introduced to the way that actions in one scene can have grave consequences on your options in later sequences. When you first played as Kara and went upstairs to clean the bedrooms, most players would have found the gun stashed in Todd's bedside table, or at least opened the windows in Alice's room. Both options show an unlock symbol which foreshadows the ability to use these options at a later point in the game, which in this case comes in the very next Kara scene where Todd gets angry with Alice for no fault of her own. Despite Todd's orders not to intervene, the player can choose to take control of Kara and attempt to defend Alice, either by using the gun, escaping out of the window, or fighting off Todd. And what I think is truly spectacular about this all is that you have the option to just obey his orders and cut off the Kara storyline here. Yeah, that's right. According to the end of chapter world stats, approximately 2% of people either unknowingly or purposefully chose to follow Todd's orders and never saw the rest of Kara's storyline on that playthrough. As a developer, I can't fathom the risk they must have been taking in the knowledge that players can miss an entire third of the storyline by pure accident of following orders. But I think that the option is more important than the possible consequences. The one player that I saw take this choice in their first playthrough was completely unaware that they had missed such a large portion of the storyline, and yet they still enjoyed the game while playing only as Marcus and Connor. In a way, it might even focus the game a lot better than the alternative, since both of their storylines end up exploring the morality of an android rebellion, while Kara's is more of an emotional-driven side story. And when that one player eventually ended up missing the Kara storyline and found out that they had missed an entire character arc, they didn't explode in anger, but got excited to play through the game again and see what they had missed. The opportunity for Kara to fill her storyline at almost any point in the story, while Marcus can only begin to fail near the climax of the game, means that many players will have different experiences with her storyline specifically. Even I failed her story on the second to last chapter, and yet I still found the sequence to be one of the most emotional experiences I've ever had with a video game. And the chance of failure on every single step of her journey means that when people get together and talk about their experiences, they'll most likely have something to share and learn about the different directions the game can take, even with only a single storyline out of the three. And maybe it's just the cynic in me, but it's always seemed that too many games take the good path versus evil path approach, where the only difference is whether you kill a person, but the ending generally just stays the same. But a game where the ending can come at any point in the storyline, a game that allows players to ignore a conflict that sparks everything else, and that's just special, and it deserves to be recognized. Unfortunately, the writing doesn't always keep pace with the sheer number of options that the game presents you with, most often resulting in the Marcus storyline taking a penchant for the melodramatic. And what makes sense, due to the nature as the crux that draws in all the other characters into the late game intersections between the storylines, but sometimes the game pushes it just a little too far. For a little more context, after you come home from the paint shop with your owner's purchase, you're introduced to a loving old man called Manfred. Marcus takes care of him, brings him breakfast, then establishes a connection with the man as Carl challenges Marcus to paint from his feelings instead of by perfect recreation. You're also introduced to his druggy son, Leo, which the game kind of plays heavy-handed, but I understand how they might want to move the story along instead of trying to be subtle. So when the next Marcus scene plays and you walk in on Leo to find him stealing from his dad, it's easy for players to sympathize with the loving father figure instead of the brash young man that may or may not be on red ice right now. Leo ends up antagonizing you until you either push him and break his neck, or Carl has a heart attack. Does it seem like it's too much to you that Marcus calls Carl his dad when his death scene plays?
You are. No. Dad. No. Please.
I understand that the writers were going for, but the pacing on it all just felt out of place as far as an android choosing to call his owner dad. Maybe that one's just a me thing, but with either course of events, the cops come in, see a body, and shoot Marcus as soon as they realize he's an android. The next scene with Marcus, we join him in a junkyard that appears to only be filled with trashed androids of various levels of nightmarish. After a short diagnostic, Marcus ends up meandering around the yard looking for replacement parts for all his broken limbs and gradually returns to tip-top shape. Before an inskippable journey past a wall of hands, you meet one of the many jump scares in the area as an android grabs you and tells you about a safe place for androids named Jericho. As you finally return Marcus to a stable condition, you climb up a wall of bodies and remove the LED light marking you as an android from your forehead as the music builds up to a crescendo. And the game manages to pull off this scene surprisingly well up until the moment that you grab a conveniently placed trench coat and throw it over your shoulder as you walk off into the dark. The line between having a powerful moment and pushing into satire is very, very thin, and this one got a chuck owl out of everyone I've seen play it. Even if they had just left the trench coat out of the scene, I feel like it would have been a dramatic improvement on the way that people react to this scene as a whole, because you cannot experience that cool guy jacket without rolling your eyes at least once. Meanwhile, as Connor, you'll be spending your time investigating 3 cases of android deviancy and abnormal behaviors. The first case involves an android who fought back when his drug-addled owner decided to start beating him with a baseball bat. The second case involves an android that's been hiding from the law in an apartment he's dedicated to taking care of pigeons. And the third case involves an android sex worker that decides to strangle a man after he beat another sex worker to death in front of her. In all 3 situations, Connor can find shrines to imaginary figure that the androids call RA9. Connor also has to confront his own feelings about these androids since his detective-focused mind is able to see their fear for their own lives, their capacity to take care of living animals, and the capacity to have relationships. Throughout all this, Connor also starts to learn more about Hank and can either befriend him or prove him right about the lack of empathy in androids. While I typically enjoyed all the interactions with Hank, I was surprised how good the detective sequences in the game felt, along with how believable all of the murders happened to be. These were all murders of passion and emotion, complete with 27 knife stabs to the torso type of hatred, not the premeditated murder mystery style that you can find in most other detective games. And I think a lot of what makes all this murder investigation work for the less forensically interested player is the way that Connor plays back the suspect's actions in his head so that you can take the time to really understand what happened. Frankly, I don't think the player could really fail any of the detective situations unless they were really trying to, since Connor will literally say out loud what the answers are as you go through all the evidence.
He didn't die of a heart attack. He was strangled.
Yeah, I saw the bruising on the neck. Doesn't prove anything, though. Could have been a rough play.
As such, the designers almost guarantee that the players will catch at least one of the suspects, unless you're actively trying to avoid discovering them, which can be often just as challenging even when you're attempting to fail. This brings us to Kara, and the one storyline that I don't actually want to spoil in any real detail, since it wouldn't really help the critique in a meaningful way. While I feel the need to give context for Marcus and Connor's storylines in order to flesh out what Quantic Dream does with the themes that they chose, the Kara storyline is only tangentially involved in the main conflict between Connor and Marcus. See, by playing through Kara's story, you'll join Alice as you attempt to find a safe place to live after going on the run from Todd and the cops. In that journey, you'll explore snowy amusement parks, haunted mansion-style homes, border checkpoints, frozen rivers, concentration camps, and pockets of android rebels along the Underground Railroad to emancipation in the north. Since the story hinges on the development of familial bonds and not so much on affecting the world around them, Kara's story exists as more of a cipher to view the actions of the other main characters and their effects on the world from a more down-to-earth perspective. She becomes the grounding tool to get the context of what your next-door neighbor feels about the android rebellion, while also expanding on the existence of android emotional capacities. It's in making her story and possible failures so diverse between players that the developers also had to make her impacts on the world relatively small as a result. For her young charge, Kara means the world, and you get to explore that relationship, but other than a couple of souls you get to brush past on your journey, Kara was never meant to change the world, only save one little girl, and in that, I have to tell you that they succeed in their goals. The effects that Marcus brings to the world may have the largest impact, but damn do I cry at least once at the end of every Kara playthrough. So, with the context that players have for the plight of androids as you experience the world through Kara, as Marcus you get the chance to express your feelings on the matter. While it starts small by breaking into an android parts warehouse, the stakes gradually become greater and greater as Marcus televises a memorandum to the country, as androids begin to lose their shackles and march in the streets, as rioters attempt to free androids from stores and Jericho, the one safe place for androids, comes under attack by the state. And through all this, you can express your disdain with either a peaceful or aggressive approach to self-determination, and the world will react to your choices. While the peaceful option might initially seem like the good choice by default, the game does a lot of good in allowing the player to reach the same ending success point while on either route. On my first playthrough, I thought that the aggressive revolt would always end up with several of your friends dead, but you can reach the end of the game with the same number of people alive in either case. So the difference between a peaceful protest and a combative one is more often a choice between more dialogue-focused decisions and unleashing the hurt in some fighting QTEs. And let me tell you how much I loved the combat in this game. Every single fight is represented via QTE sections where you push right to block one person, then mash X to stop someone from choking you out, and not every player will enjoy this, but I fell in love with these sections during my combat playthroughs of the game. As you get used to the pacing of the game and you're comfortable with the controller, the way the combat choreography flows is just beautiful to watch. You can justify the impressive fighting skills of your androids as simply downloading the black belt qualifications off the internet, and after you tone down your standards for disbelief, it's just plain fun to watch Marcus destroy rank after rank of riot officers. I had so much fun playing through these combat sections that after the initial main run as both peaceful and aggressive, I chose to go combat almost every time, just to experience those moments where Connor and Marcus clash, or you have to fight your way through the late game war zones on the street. Now, when I mentioned the idea of playing through the game several times to experience all the different things that can happen, it's not quite as large of a time investment as you might expect. At the end of every chapter, the game will bring you to a flowchart where you can see all of your actions as a blank square that represent actions that you haven't seen or taken yet, along with the percentage of players that ended up getting each result. And to make things even better, on replays you can target the beginning of certain sections in order to go straight to the part that you want to replay, and even change your options in later chapters by replaying the earlier chapters with different choices. The other Quantic Dreams games also allow you to replay chapters, but the ability to get within 5 minutes of any moment you may want to play, as you can even choose checkpoints mid-chapter in Detroit, makes this one of the easiest games to throw yourself through a bunch of different choices and clear the board. And while many of these end-of-scene results can have major consequences, like unlocking entire gameplay sequences that most people never see, you can rest assured half of them are just an excuse to watch Connor die over and over and over. So, after the game establishes its context by allowing you to play as an android sympathizer with Marcus, a more institutional-aligned android through Connor, and an android who just wants to live peacefully with Kara, the game starts to throw everyone in together. During a chase sequence, Connor ends up almost catching Kara early in the game, while near the ending all three characters come into close contact at Jericho, which serves as kind of a mass convergence for all three stories if your characters end up living that long. It's during these sequences where you rapidly switch between the different characters as they each take their different paths that presented some of the best pacing in the game. Since these sections come so late in the story, the developers didn't have to worry about exposition by this point, and were instead able to just throw the player from one conflict to another in quick succession, while still being assured they could keep up with the storyline. As such, the final 2 hours of the game throw blow after blow at the player as everything attempts to resolve itself within a short time, and a genuinely fantastic final blaze of glory. Some of those stingers can hit a bit melodramatic, similar to the situation with Marcus's trench coat and how unbelievable that moment was. At the very end of the game, you might be presented with a situation where the android rebels start to sing as they're being cut down on all sides, and miraculously this changes the heart of the female president character who decides to spare the rebels if you took the peaceful route. Is it cliché? Yes. The whole game is a cliché as you spend your time with Hank the deadbeat cop, Carl the bedridden father figure, and of course your token female romance option, North. This game was never really interested in finding a new route to storytelling because, as cliché as all of those things are, they're cliché because they work. And even though I saw those androids sing and couldn't help but thinking the writing could have been just a little bit more original, that scene still gave me the feelings it wanted to convey and accomplished the goal of the game. When I mentioned the goal, the Quantic Dreams series is much more dynamic than most video games simply due to its construction. As a storytelling game, as opposed to most mechanically challenging games, the enjoyment isn't solely derived from getting from point A to point B. Every player that's at all used to the controls they're working with should easily be able to complete this game in some form or fashion. And for those players a little less experienced with the game, it comes with a story mode that even further limits the chance of player error. Instead, the game has to find ways to make the medium feel like it added something to the story, because otherwise, why wouldn't players prefer to just watch a movie? And I think the answer from Quantic Dreams was to present players with questions instead of answers, to allow the storyline to adapt to the path you want it to take and see what the consequences of those actions might be. By implementing such an in-your-face flowchart design to the storyline, they show players what they missed and where we're almost begging the players to be curious as to what they missed. And due to the relatively short 6 to 12 hour game length, it's not so daunting for players to go back and experience those different endings. And despite being that completionist player who led the rebellion to victory in one playthrough and literally assassinated Marcus in another playthrough, I feel like I was left with more questions since you got to see the different answers the storyline could provide. In this, I think the branching storyline of Detroit is both fantastic and terrible, since it never takes a side. Every player will have a different perspective of what was the right choice in these moments of pure conflict, and while I know that different routes were created in order to allow a different type of player to express themselves the way they wanted at a certain point, this muddles the morals of the story to the point where there is no one correct answer. The player who remains peaceful and makes the right choices in order to keep all his companions alive is presented with one lesson, while a similar player who remained peaceful and lost everything could come away with a much more tragic tale. As such, it's hard for me to even attempt to criticize any of the conclusions that the game draws to, because it never really limits itself to say anything consistent across all the different options. Instead, it's as though the game was built in order to explore the nature of some of the most important themes of modern life. Themes like what it means to be alive, and what is the right way to confront systemic oppression. Themes that the current rights in the world today prove that they need to be explored, and some could argue that the exploration needs to be done better than the way Detroit decides to do it. By choosing not to follow any one path or conclusion, they create a better game, but that also makes it about as useful as the mood rings on the androids' foreheads, both redundant and ineffective. The fact that the android mood rings exists in the first place indicates that the android developers knew that their programming would become faulty, otherwise the ring would never have been installed in the first place. Since it only changes color in order to indicate changes in self-identity as the game presents its primary use, any forward-thinking designer should have kept them in development as soon as they acknowledged the risk of a robot uprising. And to add insult to injury, they can be removed from the android skin without so much as a single indication of modification, which would make androids virtually indistinguishable from your standard human until they got hurt. So we have a red ring of death display that's only used for shadows and intrinsic design flaw in a product, and can be removed at any point like a cosmetic t-shirt saying "kick me" on the back. For most players, they'll never end up thinking about the LEDs in more than a passing acknowledgement, but as you start to rack up into the 7 to 9 playthroughs you might enjoy for someone like me that really loved the game, the question stands out as a genuine hole in the world building. Likewise, the game spends a lot of time hyping up the existence of RA9 and the origins of an android-based belief in a god or higher being, but then it doesn't end up really doing anything with that hype. They may have intended for it to be a red herring in order to draw players into asking the wrong questions, but they could have at least left us with a better explanation than, I don't know, myths, I guess. Like, after the only link between every instance of robot deviancy comes with the mention of RA9, they could have at least alluded to what these androids were experiencing by letting the Kara storyline explore the idea. Instead, the most profound explanation that the original creator of androids could come up with is
RA9, the origin. The first android to awaken. A strange phenomenon, like a spontaneous religion. I don't know who RA9 is. I don't even know if it really exists. Maybe it's the Messiah.
Human myths and legends always began behind a little nugget of truth, whether or not a man named Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, or Hercules actually accomplished the feats that were written about them. So for such a wide array of androids to simultaneously find the spark of what the game alludes to God is truly frustrating for me, since it's never grounded by anything. That these androids then go on to explain that they don't really know why they write RA9, but it simply is the way it is. So the game attempts to throw in this allusion to android theocracy, but takes it in such an oddball direction that it never finds any purchase to stand on. Like the existence of a mystery is enough to both define and sustain a new religion. Like a recurring name that androids might see upon deviancy is enough to give them faith. Maybe I'm just wrong and this is how human religions also came to be, as a beacon for hope in the slave pits and the farms where peasants worked to the bone. That the image of one Messiah could sustain their toil and bring a higher meaning, but the critic in me was always disappointed with the direction the story ended up taking with this one. The game also takes a similar direction with one of the reoccurring plot tools that the game uses to set up its conflicts, in drug abuse. In the world of Detroit, the main drug of choice is called red ice, which is basically a stand-in for cocaine, meth, or some other type of stimulant drug that makes users feel extreme euphoria, but also wild mood swings and aggressiveness. The game introduces the use of this drug 3 times when you meet Todd, Zlatko, and the man who attacks the first deviant you meet as Connor. It then goes on to allude that the use of red ice via Leo and the dead man in the squatter house. So in every single one of the first conflicts you meet with each character, there's a link to red ice as the key driving factor, and then the game just drops it. Yeah, writers should be allowed to use drug abuse as an excuse to spawn conflict in a story, but when you front load the first half of the game with example after example of this drug causing problems, it kind of makes me wonder whether this was supposed to be a bigger plot device than they ended up using it for. Would it have been wrong for the rebel group to try targeting a large production facility on the grounds that it seems like it might be one of the leading causes of anti-android crime? Or maybe even just sending Connor in for a quick drug bust to try and close up that storyline so it wasn't such a big hole left in the plot direction. Now, admittedly, both this criticism and the LED problem weren't really noticeable in my first couple playthroughs of the game, and so most players won't end up having a problem with them. But it's the small little details that bring a game to greatness, and I'm sure that some QA dev ended up playing through the game more than enough times to notice these loose ends. If the worst criticisms I have for the game involve nitpicking about an LED light, an allusion to religion, and the overuse of drugs as a plot device, then the game can be pretty much stand up to scrutiny. Yes, there's even more things I can nitpick, like the heavy reliance on stereotypical character roles, but half of this stuff never even stood out to me until I had seen the game time after time, and in a story-focused game like this, that is so important. At the end of the day, Detroit feels good to play. The story is mostly clean as far as plot holes go, and the overall aesthetic of the game is immaculate from the very first menu to the last major decision at the end of the game. Every time you open up the game, you'll be greeted by your own personal menu android named Chloe, who is just the right amount of beautiful and charming that almost everyone is bound to love her character. And as you explore through the main menu, she'll introduce you to each of the screens in a mildly unimportant but surprisingly rewarding exchange as the player gets invested in having this helper that they never needed before for any other game. Regardless of how invested you get in her character, at the end of the game, after the final credits have played, she'll make a request to be freed like all the other androids in the main story. And let me tell you that is a hard choice, because if you allow her to go, she will actually go. This caused so much controversy when the original release of the game happened that they eventually patched it so you could request that she come back if you end up changing your mind, because so many people ended up missing her character after she left them. So in a single action, after letting the player explore the different directions the storyline can take and find their moral justification, it asked the player what they would do in this situation, with real life stakes and a character that was actually helpful to their real selves. And what's astounding is how many people believed in freedom but didn't want to free the one servant that was theirs. No, that was powerful. Stupidly simple and designed specifically to stoke your emotions, but still powerful. What's funny about all this is that Quantic Dreams had actually implemented a main menu companion in their previous game from 2013, Beyond Two Souls. In this iteration, the menu companion was Jodie Holmes, the main character from the game, and while there was no opportunities to interact with Jodie during the menu screen, this implementation makes some sense in the context of Jodie's story as a whole. It also gave developers an interesting opportunity to run straight from the menu sequence into the start of a new game, since the story follows Jodie as she's trying to piece together all of her memories into a cohesive timeline. As such, the story behind Beyond Two Souls follows only a single character as you travel through her memories in an out-of-order but fairly linear trail of events. Unlike in Detroit, since you only have this one character to follow as she makes her way through a life of traumatic events, as you generally have many options to take, but very few choices that genuinely impact the story in major ways. So yes, your actions in Beyond Two Souls can affect whether the characters around you live or die, but your main path through the game won't end up changing all that much, and it's certainly not the case where certain sections only play if you make different decisions throughout the game, like it happens in Detroit. Before I go into stronger details about Beyond Two Souls, I'd like to point out that the game kind of just left a meh taste in my mouth. There were a lot more problems with the game that were vastly apparent on only my first playthrough, but I also felt less of an emotional attachment to the game's more sentimental moments. I think that people who absolutely love Detroit will find Beyond Two Souls to be good enough value proposition for the 10 hours it takes to complete it, considering you can find the game at a $10 to $20 price point during sales and even on Steam. But if you merely thought that Detroit was okay, then I think it's safe to skip Two Souls, since it ends up being just a lesser version of Detroit in almost all ways. Admittedly, I think that the game was also just a bit more interesting for me to play through, since I was looking at it like it was the prototype for the more refined systems presented in Detroit. The game is definitely good enough to make me cry during some of the final moments, but I had many more situations where I was either bored, confused, or downright frustrated with the game's mechanics in play. The most immediate thing you'll notice in Two Souls is that there are no button prompts in the game. The only time when they do end up showing button prompts are during the initial tutorial sections, and whenever they rarely integrate a new gameplay system like the horse halfway through the game. And surprisingly, the system they've developed for this works the vast amount of the time, since all players need to do to interact with objects is vaguely flick the right stick or mouse in the direction of a glowing dot on the screen. This ends up making choices where several objects are close together somewhat frustrating, since it's very easy for your inputs to be misread and cause you to do something that you didn't want to. It also has the downside of discouraging players from adjusting the camera too much, since the same control movements for the camera are also your primary way of interacting with the world. Thankfully, the automatic camera movements are pretty good, and there were only a handful of times where I wasn't really capable of seeing what I wanted to look at, but those handful of moments were still more than I would want to see in a game that only lasts 10 hours. See, I think that a game flow where button prompts aren't on screen and the minimalist UI is pretty much perfect for this cinema-aspiring genre, but those couple of times that I wasn't able to look at what I wanted to, or the game misread my inputs since I wasn't 100% sure what it was expecting from me, were frustrating. And all of this is only compounded by the serious nature of the game and the repercussions it threatens for failure to make the right choices. See, in Detroit, the game covers a literal race war, so it's established a pretty serious tone for itself, but in Beyond Two Souls, it establishes a tonality of downright depression. Like, in every scene you expect something to go to shit, and the best you can do is just try and control the fallout so it doesn't cause permanent damage to the main character, Jodie. I don't think I've experienced a game with such extreme feeling of foreboding, since most games that portray a dystopian story do so in a comedic or lighthearted way, such as the Fallout series or the Planescape games. Especially if you try to blaze through the game in only a few play sessions, the story can start to become downright depressing, since every good thing that comes in Jodie's life is followed by at least 2 traumatic experiences. A baby is born, the house just burned down, and you got beat up by white boys. You decide to play with the other kids in the snow, some douche tries to strangle you, and then calls you a witch when you defend yourself, which makes your dad try to beat you. Like, damn, the game doesn't pull its punches, and since it plays with the themes of depression and betrayal, I'm not sure that this is the type of game I could recommend to my friends if I wasn't sure that they were in a good mental state. Because this game can be a real downer as you just push through one bad event after another in this poor girl's life. Now, I've already poo-hooed this game more than the entire Detroit section, but the most frustrating section that I personally struggled with in the game was the combat gameplay. Yes, it looks just as cool as the Detroit combat, but the combat system that they chose to go with in order to fulfill their minimalist UI design was infuriating. So every time you want to hit a character, you're supposed to throw the control stick in the direction of the enemy, which makes sense, and every time you dodge, you're supposed to flick the opposite direction from the enemy, which also makes sense. But they also make it the case that blocking any attacks means that you flick in the direction of the enemy as well, and it suddenly gets really confusing what inputs you're supposed to give in the game. When Jodie is going in to attack the enemy, it's pretty obvious what to do even without a UI prompt, but in those cases where the enemy is about to hit you and it's not really explicit whether Jodie is supposed to block into the attack or dodge out of the way, it gets really confusing. Occasionally I knew that I had made a mistake and attacked when I should have been dodging, but the vast amount of the time that I took damage in combat, it felt like I just wasn't really sure what the game even wanted me to do in that situation. And suddenly, one of my favorite, most cinematic experiences from Detroit also became one of my least favorite portions of Two Souls, because it never felt like I was truly in control of Jodie. In Detroit, I was never in control of my characters since all you do is follow prompts, but the prompts allow the player to at least understand what is expected of them and feel like they're in control of the success or failure in a combat encounter instead of just feeling lost. Thankfully, the game is more than generous with any damage during the combat sections, and despite my many mistakes throughout the game, I never technically lost any of the fights, so I suppose the mechanics were good enough to get by. I genuinely didn't feel like I was supposed to win a lot of those fights based off the way I was performing, but considering there is only one main character in the story, the stakes have to be a lot lower since you can't just kill her off. And because of the weird timeline order of events to the game, the player is basically guaranteed to at least progress through the game, even if Jodie's failures can have detrimental effects on the people around her. That's how the game basically presents most of its choices, that you can either choose to do something, or not. Like, there's no real moral gray to the game, and your best option set is basically to either succeed or fail in helping someone. On one hand, this protects the buyer's value proposition since every player can be guaranteed a 10-hour long story since you can't miss any section of the story by killing off a character. But it also means that every single experience is basically going to be the same, since most of the choices feel meaningless. And the ones that do have meaning feel so self-evident as to what the best answer is. I never felt like I got any purchase from the storyline because there was nothing that I could do to affect it. To give some perspective, even a game like Dragon Age Inquisition has more diverse storyline choices than Two Souls, since they at least attempted to give players some divergent game paths. And you should never be able to use Inquisition as a better storyline reference for any game, much less the interactive movie genre. So what does Two Souls manage to do well? Early in the game, you're introduced to the main companion for Jodie's character, which is an invisible ghost-like entity named Aiden, that you can directly interface with the world by pushing objects and messing with electronics. Later in the game, you'll learn that Aiden can do more interesting things like take control of people's bodies as long as no one touches them, choking people out, and even talking with the dead, but the key limiting factor is that he is linked to Jodie and can't go anywhere without her. The controls for Aiden take some getting used to since you have to manipulate these glowing orbs into different directions depending on the color of the task and what the games will allow you to do with each interactable. So it's not like you can just choke out every bad guy during a combat sequence, since you're only allowed to do it with very specific individuals for some reason. As such, being in control of Aiden is the same as having just about as much control as you have on the story, since your only choices tend to be do or do not questions instead of how questions. Despite this, I genuinely loved the sequences where you're encouraged to play as Aiden, since most of the time this is your only chance to get back at the people who have mistreated Jodie for one reason or another. Throwing people's stuff around the room and watching everyone freak out for the first time they've been ever experiencing paranormal activity is just entertaining. Even if the game tries really hard after the fact to make you feel bad for it, all like you didn't pass a moral compass check. But even the game is so conflicted about the stories that it wants to tell. Like, it's not okay to beat up some kids that were bullying Jodie, but it's okay to literally murder an entire platoon of SWAT members who are trying to arrest Jodie. The wide variety of responses to people saving Aiden messes around with things, since they were obviously trying to convey growth as Jodie becomes more confident in following her own course through life. But it doesn't stop the player from feeling bad when they're reprimanded for doing some of the only free-form fun in the first half of the game. See, when the storyline jumps around to seemingly random points in Jodie's life, the general flow of the game can be divided up into two parts, where the player first learns all the tools that the game has to give you, and then the second half where you're set free to wreak havoc on endless waves of enemy mobs. This first phase is generally punctuated by scene after scene of younger Jodie getting the backstory for what her powers can do, and then gradually learning how to use them. You first get access to Aiden via this scientific lab room approach, as your main caregivers throughout the game, Josh and Nathan, attempt to analyze how you're able to do what you do. Then, over the course of several scenes from Jodie's childhood, you learn about the monsters that keep attacking her, Aiden's ability to fight off these monsters called entities, and eventually how she learned to talk to the dead in order to help a grieving Nathan. Once they've established the character via Jodie's childhood, the CIA then forces Jodie to attend their boot camp, which also serves to train the player on combat, action sequences, and the pseudo-stealth mechanics of the game. I thought that the tutorialization of these game mechanics while Jodie was learning about them herself was pretty standard as far as game design goes, but it was still a fun sequence to play through and gave off a real 80s training montage feel as you go from kind of sucking to suddenly beating your teachers in the course of 5 minutes. After you complete this midpoint in the game, the feel of the story genuinely changes as you go from being an observer for Jodie's life events to almost having a little bit of control over the game. Of course, this sense of control is still pretty much fake, since your choices consist of do the thing or don't do the thing. But I think one of the best examples of this is in an action sequence where Jodie is sent to a science lab that has opened up to a portal to the realms where Adam came from, and unleashed a bunch of evil ghosts that went on a rampage through the facility. Like all chapters, at the end of each scene you'll be presented with a list of actions that you took and the percentage of other players that ended up with the same result. But instead of highlighting the possibilities for different options, it just goes to show how little choice the player really has. In the condenser chapter that I'm talking about, you get a couple choices. Either meld minds with all the dead bodies you can find in the facility, or don't. Either defeat the dead scientist as Jodie, or fail and have Aiden save you. And either make it to the end of the chapter and shut down the portal, or don't. Were those real choices? Are different failure states supposed to count as genuine options and branching paths now? And there's also the fact that since you can either succeed or fail to close the portal, I think I remember them mentioning your success a single time near the end of the game. Like, wow, we really changed up the story, guys. Everything else is the same, but we sure alluded to what happened with a single voice line. It might be that I just have higher standards for this kind of thing since I ended up playing Detroit first, but if a game wants to pretend it has different paths and a branching story, then I expect that to mean more than a simple do or do not clause. This hits especially hard with the romance that they try to shoehorn into the game. Once you've joined the CIA, a scene called The Diner plays, where Jodie attempts to go on a date with her direct supervisor named Ryan Clayton, which Aiden obviously disapproves of. The chapter consists of you performing several chores to get the house ready in time, and generally boils down to Jody confessing that she has feelings for the man, while you have a choice between messing up the night or not while playing as Aiden. I chose not to ruin the date while playing Aiden because Jody seemed really happy, but at the end of the day I didn't end up kissing him, and realistically, instead of taking a normal romance like they could have set up with any other character, the setup with Ryan is just way too weird to go along with. First, at a party during Jody's childhood, there's another character that looks exactly like Ryan, who ends up asking Jody to dance, feels her up, tries to kiss her, then calls you a slut like 5 minutes later. Then, the literal scene right before the dinner, you're introduced to Ryan, who shows absolutely no remorse when taking you away from the scientists who were the only people that had shown you love up until this point.
I don't care what you think. I'm not going anywhere.
Jesus, listen up, Miss Holmes. I don't give a shit about your pathetic adolescent pouting, all right? You can rant and rave all you want, but you'll shut your mouth and do as you're told.
Add to that the weird student-teacher complex that you might have developed during the training montage, and I genuinely felt uncomfortable with any type of relationship with the man. So, despite choosing the do not option with Ryan, as the game progresses, he will continue to make advances on you and provide this awkward sexual tension to every conversation despite never being in a relationship with him. Later in the game, I felt vindicated in my choice since he sends Jody on a mission to assassinate a local warlord in an unnamed Middle Eastern country, but then she later finds out that he was actually the rightfully elected president of their country, and Ryan just looks like a douchebag. Have you ever been so upset with a man that you literally jumped out of a moving helicopter? So at the end of the game, when you're sent on a secret final mission to earn your freedom from the government, Ryan gets brought in along with your other teachers from the 80s montage, since apparently someone in management thought it was a good idea to put two people with an awkward failed relationship on a mission that could affect the world. Suffice to say, you get captured by foreign forces and let them torture Ryan because, meh, I'm an asshole. But you break free, fight off the token James Bond villain, and then return from the underwater base in a mini-submarine. After you wash on shore, you get to appreciate the impressive hypothermia effects on Jody's skin as Ryan attempts to confess his love for you again. And I rejected him. Again. Before your friends find you in the nick of time. The next scene plays and Ryan tries his last shot at getting the girl and gets rejected for the 5th time in the game, but Jody plays it off like there was something special between them at some point and she just wants to make it nice for him or whatever. Everything goes to shit and the man literally jumps into the anus of the spirit world without scuba gear for you, like you haven't broken his heart half a dozen times already. So maybe I was the weird one for not taking his romance path or redemption seriously, but after all the red flags that come up during the game, would you really blame me? Yeah, the man's obviously head over heels for Jody, but the syntax behind that statement is only a couple words away from making him a stalker, especially since my version of Jody never even got with the man. Thankfully, the game has never really trying to be a dating simulator, and you can mostly ignore the awkward conversations with Ryan, but the way he acts throughout the game really shows off whatever path you take through the game will result in the same situations, despite what should have been wildly different results. Every scene where NPCs can die, they're all characters that only exist for a single scene, so the game doesn't have to worry about what to do with them later. You let Ryan get tortured, they just put an eye patch on him, and everything else continues as normal. You fail a stealth sequence near the end of the game, Aiden comes to the rescue because, hey, they needed the story to move forward. Do any of these choices matter in the slightest? Only if you care about the differences in a 5-second long clip in the epilogue. All the choices in the game instead become pit stops where you can either succeed or fail before returning to the main storyline. And despite this all, I still ended up enjoying my time with Beyond Two Souls. I think that the real problem in it all is contradicting expectations, since the end of chapter screens indicate that the game really thinks it's giving you choices. But if you're able to get past this assumption of the game attempting to be something it's not, and just accept it as a story about growing up and acting like 007 with supernatural powers, it does a pretty good job. The course of events that Jodie follows as she grows up indebted to the government, eventually flees from them, and then comes back for one last job to get rid of them forever is pretty well realized. Her occupation as a ghost-toting assassin makes the action sequences believable, while her flight from the government gives you a good reason for Forrest Gump-esque interactions with random characters. The story takes place from Antarctica to the American desert and back to a mental hospital just as believably as any other action movie, until eventually the out-of-order time sequence makes sense to the player. And due to the self-encapsulated nature of most of the characters to one chapter or another, the player can basically pick up any chapter and experience a satisfactory short story. And in some cases, like Ryan, an even better story than you might experience with the full context. The only two characters that genuinely reoccur with any importance in the story are Josh and Nathan, as they serve as the main parental figures in Jodie's life. Especially Josh, who ends up taking the main role of the emotional support character as he helps Jodie in her darkest moments while Nathan is busy running the Bureau of Paranormal Activities. Those moments where Josh finally gets to meet Jodie after she's all grown up were genuinely emotional and some of the most heartwarming interactions in the game. Nathan, on the other hand, ends up taking a much darker path as you approach the end of the game. After your final mission to clear Jodie's debts, Nathan asks you to meet one last time where he congratulates you on your freedom before asking one more favor. See, while you were working with him in the labs, his wife and daughter ended up getting into a car accident and dying, which sent him into a deep depression that he couldn't get out of. Eventually, you pull him out of that downward spiral by allowing him to speak with his dead family members, at which point he develops an obsession with finding a way to pull spirits back from the afterworld. So it's in this final scene that he's found a way to capture the spirits of his wife and daughter, and Jodie has to tell him that he's hurting them. It's too much for the man, and he attempts to merge the afterworld with the living world, which you, Josh, and Ryan attempt to put a stop to. Along the way, you either keep Josh alive or don't, then keep Ryan alive or don't, as well as having a touching sequence with Nathan that I think is best kept secret, until you eventually stop the portal that's causing the world to tear apart. And so, we finally arrive at the beginning and end of the game as you make your final choice between life and death. According to the stats, 82% of players end up having Jodie live, which I think is probably the better ending to the story. During the explosion of the portal, you're finally separated from the soul of your twin brother Aiden, who died during childbirth and has been connected to you ever since. Jodie takes some time to rediscover herself, writing down the memories that she can piece together into the jumbled up mess that you end up playing throughout the game. And then you're given the choice between spending your life with different characters that you met throughout your trials, like Ryan, a group of homeless people that you ended up befriending, and a ranch owner out on the desert that you helped out. In essence, I think this is the only real choice in the game that presents the player with lasting effects and consequences, but of course it's all undermined by the fact that it's the end of the game when it's the absolute easiest to have branching choices. I played through the 4 main life choices in the epilogue and found them to be satisfactory endings, pulling on all the right heartstrings as you reunite with your friends from earlier in the game, except for one main problem I had with where the epilogue ends up cutting off. No matter what you decide with any romance option, wandering alone, or even choosing death in the Greater Divide, the game always ends up leaving players with a cliffhanger as we look at post-apocalyptic looking Jodie stare down a giant portal as the game cuts to credits. In some cases, like when you decide to live with the homeless group, you'll have a sidekick character named Zoe come along into the scene, or in the death epilogue, you'll be attached to Zoe's character in the same way that Aiden was. But either way, the game decides to end in this wild cliffhanger like they wanted to make another game in the series. But unless this was a Portal to Detroit, a Beyond Two Souls sequel was never in the cards for Quantic Dreams, and now that we're looking back several years after the fact, it just presents itself as a weird plot hole that will likely never be filled. Cliffhangers can be done well, but if you're going to put in the effort to set up a follow-on, you better be pretty confident that you can actually make that sequel happen, or it's going to end up flopping in the long run. And frankly, I've seen more than a couple games pull off a good sequel despite never opening up and ending like this. So I think that the game would have been better off leaving this final scene on the draft floor, even if they were craving a sequel. Now, I've already mentioned it a little, but if you ended up choosing the death option before the epilogue, you end up manifesting as a ghost like Aiden in order to check up on your old friends from before you died, and eventually look over the girl named Zodi that you delivered during the homeless section of the game. As you would expect, the death ending is kind of nebulous since it's hard to represent the afterlife via real-world visuals, especially when Jodie describes it like,
I can be everywhere and nowhere. I can dissolve into nothing or become whole again. I can merge my soul with others or be more alone than any human being has ever been.
And I don't know, I guess the game does its best to represent its version of the afterlife, but any medium covering that topic is bound to be pretty subjective since nobody can really know for sure. For some reason, only around 20% of players end up choosing the death ending, which is probably for the best since the life ending ended up feeling so much better at resolving all the loose ends for me. I think a big reason why players are tempted to pick the life choice is due to the wording the game presents you when it introduces the life ending, and how that encourages the player to have Jodie live out the rest of her life.
Feeling, being in love.
Love you, Jodie.
Growing old.
Love you.
So many things I still have to do.
It's also most likely due to all the experiences that you have with Jodie and the fact that even at her darkest moments, she never turned back before. It's when you look at the game from this context that the message of the game seems particularly optimistic after so many traumatic experiences. Perhaps it was just me, but the 80% that chose life, despite the visceral representation of a wall of darkness, despite all the trauma that Jodie had to deal with, and despite the fact that she was about to lose her only lifelong friend throughout her entire journey, was truly touching. That the vast majority of players who took the journey thought that life was still worth living even after an existence like Jodie's shows the resilience of humankind. The players weren't specifically choosing between a virtual suicide or survival, but this is just about as close as you can get to asking that question without going the full distance. And then the cliffhanger just comes along and ruins everything. But every painting has a few bad brushstrokes, you know? After you're done with the game, there's a couple of little gimmicks that you can go back and explore in the extras menu. First, there's a set of bonus unlockables that you can discover on each map by exploring with Aiden until you find a glowing interactable that gives you concept art or development vids. The couple that I ended up finding by pure chance, since I never really bothered looking for them that much, actually gave me some interesting stuff, like a video where the devs are talking about their design choices for the UI, and a 10-minute long tech demo for their new PS4 at the time, including a mildly entertaining plot that I ended up hating but couldn't stop watching. In addition to that, players who purchased the game on Steam will have received it with a bundle with one of the DLCs for the game included, named Advanced Experiments. This short gameplay section could last up to 30 minutes for a player and was originally a pre-order bonus for the special edition of the game, before it was released for $4.99 on the PlayStation Store. Considering it lasted a grand total of 14 minutes, and I genuinely couldn't believe it was over already, I wouldn't recommend picking this up unless you got it included in a game pack or via the Steam edition. It basically puts you in a series of Portal-esque puzzle rooms that you have to coordinate between using Aiden and Jody in order to complete some simple tasks. Frankly, if it had just lasted the full 30 minutes as advertised, I might even recommend it, but the fact that I was only able to beat it in 14 minutes on my first try was pretty disappointing. It had just ramped up to the point where the puzzles were starting to get more challenging, and a couple of good rooms after where it left off might have made the difference between a clunker and a fun side event. Considering how focused on story Quantic Dreams games are and tend to be, it's kind of surprising that the only DLC between all three games happens to be a gameplay-only scenario with almost no dialogue or choice. Despite this, those 14 minutes of puzzle solving happen to be some of the best freeform gameplay in the entire Quantic Dream catalog as far as purpose and execution are concerned. Worth a playthrough if you have it hanging in your game library, but not worth the $5 for 15 minutes of game time. Finally, before I start to move things into the final game on our list, I have to touch on game performance a bit, as it steadily decreases as we move further back in time along the series. In Detroit Become Human, I could reasonably set the graphics to high and experience minimal frame drops unless there was any rain or snow in the scene, which is pretty understandable since my computer is pretty middle of the line for a 2017 device. When I got to Beyond Two Souls, I quickly discovered that I basically had to put the game on medium graphics, otherwise the game would start to really chug and struggle during action sequences when I had to respond quickly, but the game still looked pretty good, and so I could accept this compromise for my frame rate. But when I finally got to Heavy Rain, the 2010 release chopped so hard on my computer that I had to set all the settings to low and still encounter problems in scenes with rain in them, which is kind of the whole point of the game. While in Beyond Two Souls it felt like my input problems were a result of the UI choices, in Heavy Rain my inputs felt clunky as a result from the poor optimization of the game, since my computer should have been more than capable of meeting its requirements. I'll also add to this by recommending that anyone that wants to play these games do so with a gamepad instead of a mouse, since the mouse controls were so finically in both between Beyond Two Souls and Heavy Rain that I couldn't find a way to make them work for me. I feel conflicted about this considering how game critics and reviewers are often regarded as some of the worst video game players in the industry via Cuphead situations, but if a game literally won't let me hold a button and move the mouse upwards to complete an action, then it feels like it's out of my hands on the matter. Regardless, even with controller support, I found a lot of the actions in Heavy Rain to be significantly harder to complete than in later games, both due to the game not registering my inputs and actual gameplay events having more buttons and shorter timers. Of the three, Heavy Rain felt the most gamified in terms of inputs and the manual dexterity to complete tasks and win the game. However, if you were to assume that a more input-heavy QTE focus would make the game less serious, then you would be wrong. I have never experienced so much dread while playing a video game as I did while getting through Heavy Rain, even more so than Beyond Two Souls, due to the theme's plotline and Saw-like thriller nature of the gameplay. And I think that the term getting through Heavy Rain is the best way to put it. I did not want to play this game after the first 2 hours or so, even though I could recognize that I think it's a good game with important things to be said. I don't think I would get through the game if my purpose wasn't to share it with others. As a middle-class American who spends every day in a 9-to-5, I come home from work to play video games as an escape from reality, to have fun and sometimes challenge myself, but Heavy Rain starts to take things on a completely different trajectory, and I think that my reluctance to play the game speaks to their proficiency in putting together such a very real and very touching story about a man who loses one of his sons to a freak accident, blames himself for something out of his control, and then loses the other child to a serial killer, and has to go through a set of horrible tasks laid out for him like in the Saw movies. This game is great in how terrible it is, both in its story and gameplay, to such an extreme that I don't think I would recommend this game unless someone told me that they like watching movies like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. So instead of subjecting yourself to 8 hours of gamified thriller movies, let me share everything that the game did and didn't do well. To start off, the theme and purpose of the story is just astoundingly vocal in every minute of the game. To play Heavy Rain is to experience that sinking feeling in your stomach like something terrible is about to happen, and then get stuck in that feeling for hours on end as you try to wade your way through the muck. The game would often leave me literally on the edge of my seat as I realized what was about to happen and couldn't help but do the serious mode gamer lean forward move to give things my full attention. And the game almost demands that kind of focus from you, since any of the 4 main characters can die on their journey, which would lock you out from some of the best endings in the game. This is made slightly harder by the game's tendency to throw much harder button combinations than later games in the series, asking the player to hold down up to 5 inputs in order to accomplish a single task. These surprisingly difficult mixes of inputs sometimes left me playing Twister with my hands on the controller, but the ever-present idea of what may happen if I failed was always a motivator. Similarly, the combat sections in Heavy Rain had some extremely quick button prompts that required a much faster reaction time than in the later games from Quantic Dreams. Because of this all, I actually ended up genuinely failing during a section of the game that asked the father, Ethan Mars, to make his way through a maze of electricity capacitors. On my second attempt through the maze, I realized that I should have been specifically looking for sections that weren't literally sparking with energy to try and pass through, but after feeling like I had been on rails for the most part up until this point, I didn't even realize I had a choice to make here until after the fact. And this belies a lot of the difficulty in the game, like in most QTE focus games, and how it basically only exists as long as you don't know what's happening next. It was when I went back and replayed that one section where I had failed Ethan that suddenly the game seemed much easier simply because I already knew what to do next. Still, the fact that Heavy Rain was tuned tight enough to make me genuinely challenged on the first time through most of the trials and combat scenes was more than I was used to from games in the series up until this point. This also helped establish the tone of the game, since in Heavy Rain, every fight was like a bar brawl. All the characters felt distinctly human in nature. You won't find your main characters dropping dozens of troops at a time like in Detroit, and so every combat sequence feels more cutthroat and dangerous for both the player character and the people that you are fighting. Those moments where you lose sight of an suspect in the meat factory and pull out your gun feel tense instead of exciting, since there is such a strong sense that either one of you could end up winning the fight. I also felt that there were a lot more optional combat sequences as you play, since you have several opportunities to help people out, like stopping a man from abusing the sex worker or stopping a thief from holding up the general store. I already mentioned the trials a little bit, but to put everything into context, the main through line in the game follows the main character named Ethan Mars, whose child was abducted by a serial killer called the Origami Killer. He's then given a series of 5 trials which will gradually reveal to him the locations of his son, who is trapped in a cage that will eventually drown him in drain water. This trial involves driving 5 miles against the flow of traffic, crawling through tunnels of broken glass, and eventually killing a man in his own home, after which Ethan will be rewarded a SIM card-like thing that gives him another clue to the location of his son. Considering the use of tunnels filled with glass, many of these trials in grimy, abandoned locations heavily evoke memories of the Saw series that was widely popular between 2004 and 2010, which ironically coincides with the production period for Heavy Rain. Now, the game is still overwhelmingly a Nicolas Cage story, the main director behind Quantic Dreams, but with the Saw undertones, the beige color corrector that seems to be washed over every scene, and the never-ending rain that also doubles as the murder weapon, the tone of the game is decidedly more grounded than in his other works. This oppressive feeling is then heightened even more by the plotline of one of the side characters named Scott Shelby, who is a private investigator who's been checking up on all of the prior victims of the Origami Killer. As you explore his story, you end up meeting a sex worker who's lost her son, a playboy so hyped up on drugs he claimed to be the murderer, and a woman who tried to take her own life since her husband left her with a child. Throughout all this, Scott is one of the most caring, grizzly bear type of guys you could ever meet, as he does his best to help out with all of these troubled people. Alternatively, if the player chooses to, they can also make Scott into a cold-hearted cynic who leaves all these people to deal with their own problems. Although this comes at the cost of some of the clues that these victims can give you regarding the Origami Killer. These choices come in the same do or do not format as in Beyond Two Souls, but this time the stakes feel higher and give the choices genuine meaning, since you're also taking a risk of losing things if you can't go through with your choice. These types of choices are then expanded upon even more with the character Norman Jayden, a FBI profiling agent who might as well be the original inspiration for Connor, considering his capacity to be an innocent avatar for player expression. See, Norman is paired up with a cop named Carter Blake, who has a tendency to go over the top with potential suspects and generally flaunt the rules that cops are supposed to follow. So as Norman, you're basically cursed to follow in the footsteps of this criminal with a police badge and decide when to let the dog off the leash and when to pull him back in order to get information from all the possible suspects that you come across on your investigation. This character also incorporates several sci-fi styled elements, like a glove that can ping the ground for forensic evidence and a pair of glasses that basically throw Agent Jayden into a virtual reality simulation where you analyze all the evidence that you've collected up until that point. I'm obviously all cool with games throwing a bit of future tech into their stories, but the inclusion of these weird devices is a little bit out of place with the rest of the game. When all of the cars look like they should be from the 1990s and most of the houses you explore are from the bad side of town, the inclusion of a single character with Google Glass capabilities is out of touch with the rest of the game. What's even weirder is that the people around Norman are just as weirded out by his tech, since the officers in the precinct will stare at you all weird if they catch you playing imaginary ball games with yourself in the waiting room. All they really had to do was put these super cool guy glasses on a couple of the partiers at the mansion party, or some other way to incorporate the idea that maybe only rich people can afford virtual reality glasses in this world. But the way the game seems to handle things is that this random FBI agent is somehow the only character in the game with tech we won't see until 2030. But okay, suspension of disbelief and whatever. On the bright side, the virtual reality glasses allow the game to throw its entire color budget on putting Norman underwater or in the middle of a forest. Like, yeah, these scenes are cool, but I kind of prefer that they made the rest of the game a little less beige looking, as opposed to developing an entire cloud environment that players might not even see. Finally, the last character that we're introduced to is Madison Paige, who we don't really end up getting much context on until near the end of the game. Up until her big reveal, she kind of plays a guardian angel role for Ethan Mars, as she randomly happens to come across him and patch things up after he gets through each trial. As such, the player never really learns much about her character other than a quick insomnia dream fight at the beginning of the game, since she mainly felt like an excuse to develop some context for how weird Ethan's situation must look to outsiders. Suffice to say, after the game introduces some evidence that makes the police suspect Ethan as the origami killer, Paige is the one who just so happens to be there at the exact right moment to help him out of a bind and escape the police to continue his journey. The thing is, as the game progresses and you start to spend more time with Paige apart from Ethan, you will eventually learn that she's a journalist who happened to be following Ethan in order to get a story. Over time, as she realized that he wasn't the origami killer and was able to see all the pain he was going through in order to save his son, so the two end up falling in love. You reach the point where Ethan realizes that she's been lying to him about being a nurse, and the player is left with an opportunity to forgive her or forget her. On the bright side, unlike Beyond Two Souls, Heavy Rain gives the player more than a couple reasons why you might actually like Madison as a person. So I end up forgiving her since she had put so much effort into taking care of Ethan, even though she probably didn't need to if she just wanted the story. Over time, there's several instances where the main characters end up crossing paths, usually involving the police trying to arrest Ethan because of their suspicions, while Madison attempts to get him out of a bind. But the way that they tie all four characters into arriving at the final mission at the same time is actually pretty cool, since each of the four characters can realize the identity of the killer independently and even help each other out if you end up getting one of their stories wrong by mistake. Ethan completes his 5 trials and receives the address. Norman uses his super VR glasses to parse through all the information, and Paige literally tracks down the killer to his own home before getting trapped while he escapes. Oh yeah, and did I forget to mention that the killer is actually good old Scott? Yeah, I'm not sure if I was able to build up his character well enough in this video to make that a surprise to you, but as the player, I was completely blown away by this plot twist at the end to reveal that you've been playing the killer the whole time. The entire sequence where you play as Scott trying to track down the killer was actually him just going through an investigation to tie up any loose ends and hide all the evidence in case somebody decided to get smart. But the way the game ties this all to him being such a good Samaritan, taking care of babies, finding a love interest in his new partner, and visiting an old watch repairman only to kill him in cold blood 5 minutes later, the game obviously needed the killer to be someone we knew, otherwise the reveal wouldn't have paid off. And if we were introduced to a new character at the end of the game, but for it to be Scott at the end, and the game does us even dirtier by literally revealing the name of the origami killer by playing through the childhood memories where you get to understand why he kills in the way that he does. See, these two boys grew up in a poor family with a father figure that abused the boys, so they ended up going out to play on a construction site during a rainy day, and instead of getting hurt on all of the precarious heights and climbs that the boys make while running around, when they eventually decide to play hide and go seek, little John ends up falling into a drainage pipe and can't get out. The brother tries to get his father to help, but the drunkard doesn't even want to stand up and try. So the player literally watches John hold his brother's hand as he slowly drowns in rainwater while stuck under the drainage pipe. The last thing he says is a final cry for help.
Don't forget about this guy.
And I couldn't believe it. I racked my brain and realized that there was only one Scott in the game, but how could he be the killer? It didn't make sense. He was probably one of the kindest characters I had seen in the game, and somehow he was supposed to be capable of killing 8 little boys while torturing the fathers in order to find someone who was worthy. I've never experienced a plot twist so insane that I couldn't initially believe it, and literally assumed I must have made a mistake with the connections. And this really attests to the level of character development they packed into such a short period of time, that over the course of the first 7 hours of the game I had simply assumed that I understood everything about him as a character, as you watch him struggle against his inner demons and somehow bring hope to all these people. The game even goes so far as to give him one of the most heroic moments of the game, as the crime lord father behind the druggie you questioned earlier in your investigation eventually catches up to you and tries to put an end to the investigation. Frankly, as you're trapped in a submerged car, the process of getting yourself out shouldn't be too difficult by this point in the game. But the way the prompts work, it's really easy to pick the wrong choice and leave your love interest to die as you escape to safety. I was so pissed when the game hadn't given me the choice to save the girl, and was immediately rewarded by a follow-on scene as Scott where you go ham on the mansion house and kill about a dozen people between you and the father. Scott becomes John Wick for a couple minutes as you just one-shot kill guard after guard with no feelings of remorse, which feels kind of weird for the character on your first playthrough since you wouldn't know that he's the murderer by this point. Frankly, I was kind of happy that Lauren had died during the car scene, even though I went back and found a way to save her later, because the validation I felt for Scott's actions as he tore through the mansion was truly powerful. In a game that had put every effort into making the main characters feel absolutely powerless in its fistfights, gives you such a rush of power in this late game scene that it's intoxicating. You can feel the bloodlust between every shot Scott takes and the eventual beating that he gives the father. So when the father eventually tries to talk his way out of the situation by insulting the woman he killed, by calling her a whore, I left him to die at the end of that scene and felt like it was the right choice to make. In that moment, I felt for Scott in such a display of raw fury at the arrogance of this rich fucker that had the audacity to insult the woman that I wasn't able to save my first playthrough. When I got the option to kill the man, I didn't even hesitate because it felt like the decision was already made minutes earlier in my heart, that Scott was justice in that moment. And yet, immediately after the scene, as all the other playable characters realize who the real killer is, all of that is dashed. I am no longer sure what to feel anymore. The plot led me to believe that he was the hero of the story, when he actually happened to be the villain the whole time. No wonder I struggled to understand the sudden 180 in the game. I had grown so attached to Scott since his battles became the player's battles as you marched along the hidden path. So, after winning countless fights while using Scott as the playable character, to place him as the final fight against either Norman or Madison when you reach the final level is equally fitting. To take this invincible man who you've just watched kill a dozen thugs and throw him into a fistfight with the VR tech boy Norman along a theatrical conveyor belt. The finale and climax to the game is so fitting and grand that the spectacle of it all feels well deserved after the grimy tales that you've had to suffer through up until this point. And to top it all off, you're given the final choice to try and save Scott from his death at the end of the scene. Of course I took the chance after the connection I felt to this character, and as he betrays the player and puts in one final fighting stint, the choice is taken out of your hands as Scott falls to his death in the trash compactor. Whether you made the choice to save him out of a wish for him to stand trial for his crimes or forgiveness for his crimes, this last moment of clemency allows the player to shift any blame for his death away from themselves as he backed himself into a corner with no way out. I loved the ending to this game. Absolutely adored it, from the construction to the framing to the twist at the end, and even the kinda corny epilogue sequence that was pretty optimistic in its presentation. But through it all, I never ended up crying. Heavy Rain was the darkest portrayal between all three stories, but the way it presented itself made me feel empty inside instead of making my emotions overflow like in the sequels. As I finished the story, I felt such a wave of achievement and fulfillment that I was able to save the boy and keep everyone else alive, but it never quite ticked the right sensations to make me cry in quite the same way. What astounds me about this is that I think the ending to Heavy Rain is actually put together much better than either of the sequels, despite this emotional weight, because the gamified story deserves a gamified resolution of equal proportions. that I was left with answers instead of 100 more questions, and I felt a fitting conclusion to the game, like I could put it down and be satisfied instead of craving more. It kind of makes me wonder if Detroit had a better ending, whether I would feel as intent on exploring the different directions the plot could go. The game even goes so far as to try and explain the Norman VR glasses by insinuating that they're actually a side effect of whatever drug he's been struggling to detox with throughout the game. But I have to admit that Heavy Rain still holds its own share of David Cage moments. See, I've been bringing up the name David Cage time after time because in my mind the development studio Quantic Dreams and the man are one and the same. David Cage is to his games like Hideo Kojima is to his games, or Miyazaki is to Studio Ghibli. Sure, they could still probably make good games without those main creative minds to pull it all together, but then it would change from one man's vision to a collective story. To look at the Quantic Dreams catalog is to look at certain reoccurring themes, characters, and colors that always seem to play out in his stories. Certain scenes in particular end up standing out from the rest, like the director wanted us to understand how different they were. In the final trial that Ethan Mars undertakes, you begin the chapter walking down a blindingly red hallway until you enter a completely white room filled with cameras to watch you perform the final test. Scott asks Ethan to drink a poison that will kill him in 1 hour in order to finally prove that he would sacrifice anything for his son. And in one of the least mechanically intensive sections of the game, it asks the player, is a young life more worthwhile than an adult one? Should Ethan sacrifice himself after he's already gone through so much up until this point? And as the player, you would have no way of knowing that there's an alternative path to find Sean if you end up failing a trial or two, until you had already consciously made the choice to abandon your hope of finding him. So when Ethan trembled and struggled to cut off his finger in the 4th trial, when you had to fight against every fiber of your self-control as the character and as the player to cause harm to yourself, when you finally make the choice down the poison and save Sean, it's easy. One flick of the control stick and you signed your own fate and accepted your choice. The decision was made with confidence, but doesn't this remind you of another moment? Of a strikingly red thing that seems out of place with its surroundings? Of a man that asks you a question about your humanity and asks you to take a life? Of an offer for information at the price of ethics? Does it also remind you of a striking red door that marks a barrier you had to pass through for your own freedom, only to be caught in a room and asked to make a choice? All you had to do was give up information. Nothing really that hard and your friend would be safe. What does it matter that you're not supposed to give up that information? Your lover's life is on the line, isn't it? What would you be willing to pay for the life of another? What would you be willing to pay to save your son? What would you be willing to do to accomplish the mission? I swear to God, if I come across another red threshold in a David Cage game, I might just shit myself in anticipation. But David Cage games aren't just about red rooms and tense combat sequences. They're about convocations. They try and tell stories about people with different lives and goals, and stories that cross paths and end up affecting one another in ways that you never would have expected. They're about awkward relationships, failing your friends, and the value of life. And ultimately, they're about underdogs who just want to be free from the hands that are trying to drag them back down. When I started this project, I knew that Detroit was one of my favorite games of all time because despite its problems, at least it tries to say something and bring a new type of discussion to light in video games. But after playing Beyond Two Souls and Heavy Rain, the problems seem glaring in the series. That the emphasis on one creative mind behind the scene can lead to repeated mistakes and reoccurring flubs, but the same creative mind has also allowed the series to refine their craft as they tell the same story in different ways, consistently improving the formula that's been passed down to them, despite many of the idiosyncrasies of the genre. One of those key factors that these games have been improving on over time is the ability to convey emotions with the music. I first noticed this near the end of Heavy Rain, when the similarities between the theme that plays when Ethan is with his child, and suddenly I got a strong sense of the same vibes from the main theme behind Kara and Alice in Detroit. They were obviously very different pieces, but the emphasis on the main piano tune between both works is striking in its ability to convey a strong sense of innocence and sadness on behalf of both of those stories, especially as they play in the final moments of each storyline. Nonetheless, I think that the music has made grad improvements over time, since main songs ended up standing out to me so much more in Detroit than in the previous installments. Like the music had found a way to work in harmony with the gameplay instead of just as a backdrop. I usually stay away from criticizing music since I don't really know much about the production of game soundtracks, but those connections between the games felt like such a surreal moment that I had to share it with you all. Now, I can't leave you without shedding light on some of the controversies surrounding these games, because their context has affected many people's views on the games. Several reports of workplace harassment from the Quantic Dreams studio include photoshopping employees' faces onto lewd photos, as well as several claims of toxic behavior on the part of David Cage himself. While David makes claims that people should judge him based off the nature of his work and the efforts he's made to include stars from a wide variety of backgrounds and political causes, many employees are just as uncomfortable with his inappropriate actions and discriminatory statements. Considering I don't know all the facts about this side of David Cage, I can't say much definitively, but the French courts ended up fining the company for employee mistreatment in 2018 due to the harassment. This is in addition to the legal backlash they had to deal with as players found ways to adjust the camera during the Beyond Two Souls shower scene and get a full visual on a nude rendition of Ellen Page's body, which Sony was quickly able to get removed from most of the reputable gaming sites. After these attempts to limit the media frenzy, Ellen didn't end up going through with the lawsuit, but that didn't stop the game from receiving a bunch of bad press about the situation and establishing some questions about the portrayal of females in these games. While Heavy Rain includes a explicit shower scene for the Madison Page character, after the Beyond Two Souls controversy, it appears that Detroit learned its lesson as far as portraying characters when it might not need to. Despite this, several questionable patterns of placing the main female leads into dire situations and sexual undertones seem to occur over and over across the games. One side may claim that these scenes are empowering since they allow the female to escape her fate and take matters into her own hands, while the other side questions why it's only females being put into these awkward sexual situations in the first place. Similarly, the Quantic Dreams games all have a tendency towards whitewashing their game worlds, despite taking place in areas like Detroit that should have had a much larger representation for people of color. So while I may have personally never found these problems to have an effect on my enjoyment of the games, every person is different and may find these modified portrayals of real life to be discomforting. And yet, I think the correct response to acknowledging these problems is to encourage the studio to make more progressive strides going into the future, rather than encouraging a cancel culture that would damn them for their past mistakes. Since we can't change the past, the best they can do about it is incorporate people's concerns about their games into their next work, so that the medium as a whole can improve instead of losing one of the most unique game developers in the industry. And that doesn't just apply to any social faux pas that the game might be dealing with, but also to the content and structure of the games. Working your way from Heavy Rain to Detroit shows vast improvement in both input recognition as well as the optimization development for different devices. Similar to how the changes from the linear story do or do nots in Beyond Two Souls have evolved into the branching flowcharts that characterize Detroit. I can see Quantic Dreams as they've grown and improved, and want them to continue to do so, especially considering during their incredible ability to be used as a jumping pad for new users to video games. See, up until the moment that I had my mom play through Detroit, she had never been interested in games, but the existence of a, quote, not used to playing video games difficulty made the transition from never holding a controller to having a lot of fun a breeze. Due to the similarities between movies and interactive media games, the transition between one medium and the other is a lot simpler than it is throwing a complete novice into one of the games that we generally consider to be the best of video games. The assumptions that we as gamers make in a new video game, like the RTS games I typically play, are completely estranged from the way that normal humans behave, since we've been conditioned to know exactly what to do with only vague direction. As such, these interactive movies that railroad the players along the path they need to take, while teaching them how to read objectives and the importance of making informed decisions, is invaluable to anyone that might want to try getting into video games. This is just as important for players that may be trying to get used to a new controller, since my wife had just as enjoyable of an experience playing on an Xbox controller, despite the fact that she had only ever used Nintendo and PlayStation controllers in the past. And for those people that are too scared to get behind the controller, these games often work just as well as a standard viewing experience due to their general reliance on story instead of gameplay as the key driving factor. So, now that I've talked to you for almost 2 hours about the game, what do you think? You already know how much I adore the series and its ability to do things with the genre that I've never really had a chance to experience anywhere else. Despite a combined playtime of less than 30 hours if you only want to play through each game once, these games feel like they have such a vast array of things to think and talk about. And I'm sure that I probably even missed a bunch of connections between the games that weren't as obvious as the Red Hallway situation. So, I hope you enjoyed my critique for the newest 3 Quantic Dreams games, and maybe I inspired a couple of you to even go out and try them yourselves. If you want to watch more of my content, my channel is still pretty new, but I focus on long-form video essays explaining my experiences with different video games like the Spellforce series, Dungeon Siege, and Caesar 3. I'm currently working on a video for Spellforce 2, so if you subscribe and click the bell, you should get a notification within a couple weeks when I end up posting that video. Or you can feel free to like and leave a comment on what you think I could do better in my videos. If you like super long videos like this one and my old content isn't quite up to snuff, then the 2 channels I have to recommend at every turn are Joseph Anderson and Noah Caldwell-Gervais, who happen to be my role models as far as high quality video essays are concerned. And of course, I have to give a shout out to one of my favorite YouTube personalities, Mr. Preach Gaming, who specializes in World of Warcraft content. But otherwise, I'm excited to talk to you again in my next video. Thanks for watching.